going up. Elevator systems. Bowen family systems theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, where we present Bowen family systems theory ideas in brief, clear, and hopefully understandable ways. Today is the second half of our 2 episodes looking at differentiation of self. My name is Dixie Vandersloos, and I'm a counselor located in a lovely small town in Manitoba, Canada. I'm also a member of the Faculty of Living Systems. Katie White has stuck through the season to the very end, sharing her thinking on Bowen theory. And Katie is a marriage and family therapist in Vancouver and the executive director of Living Systems Counseling and Training. Welcome, Katie.
Thanks, Dixie. It's been a good workout for me.
And Amie Post is our guest again today. Amie is a marriage and family therapist in Baltimore, Maryland, where she works as a coach, consultant, and educator based in Bowen theory. She was recently named as the Interim CEO, president of the Center for Family Systems Theory of Western New York, and until 2023 was the executive director at the Family Crisis Center of Baltimore County. She's been studying Bowen theory for over 2 decades and appreciates how people and organizations can move forward from challenge and upset with capacity, conviction, and courage. Amie's on the faculty of the Bowen Center in Washington and a member of the board. And in her spare time, she has energy for her relationships as a wife and a mom of 3 adult children and 1 grandson. So thanks for joining us again, Amie.
Thanks, Dixie. I'm glad to be here with you and Katie.
Well, today we're looking at the second part of differentiation of self, which highlights maybe more of the external relationship aspects of the concept. So, Amie, I'll let you start with your elevator pitch.
Thanks, Dixie. I was thinking as we were getting ready to start this, just that differentiation of self, we sometimes chunk it out into 2 parts, and it's really hard to separate them. The aspects we're going to talk about today, individuality and togetherness, are intertwined with the other aspects of differentiation we talked about before, emotional systems and intellectual systems. And I haven't yet figured out which comes first. Are we more organized and oriented by the togetherness life force, and so our emotional system is the most activated part of our capacity? Or do we have an emotional system that organizes and orients us toward other, that inhibits our ability to start to think about being a separate self, which then would promote our intellectual system? I'm not sure. It's probably in systems work, not one or the other. So that's been interesting to me. When I think about differentiation of self around this organizing with the togetherness life force or the individuality life force, I think there's a tension that sometimes sets up. People will put it on 2 sides of a continua and act like they're pulling against each other. And it's changing for me when I set them side by side and think about making them a team that can accomplish greater good if they work in more thoughtful partnership than if they're constantly jockeying with one another.
Yeah, Amie, you hit on quite a few of the things that I was thinking about. You know, I also have begun to really think about how each of them, I think I said this last episode, but how each of them are a resource to me to think about individuality and togetherness. But for my really quick elevator pitch about this part of it, I think the way that I understand this side of it is that there's this energy or force within us to want to be part of a group, to want to belong. And then another force, not an opposing, but I think another force that wants to be a self, be independent, to do your own thing. And I think it's just watching in each of us which one of these is more dominant. And I think sometimes we can have some choice around that. And I think other times, like we talked about last time, that it really is this instinctual process. Yes, that is really driving us towards other, or to be our own self and stand on our own 2 feet. And I wrote, I think, I don't know if this was in my pitch, but I think it's also an example of, I think if you watch any family under stress, when I was in university, there was a professor who was doing multi-systems therapy where he used to track on a computer a preschool and used to watch who kind of moved towards and around each other. And I've always said that would be the coolest experiment to do at like a family reunion, because I think when families get under a little bit of stress, or a funeral or a wedding, to watch kind of who moves towards each other, who moves away, and just to get some knowledge of how your family functions. So that's my pitch, and maybe move it a little bit, an example.
And I think mine probably highlights the differentiating move, sort of away from the group. So, but I appreciate that you guys are highlighting the teamwork aspect of it. But here's what I wrote. My short one was my ability to think my own thoughts while breathing the same air as another person. And my longer one was the second part of differentiation is more external, and it has to do with how we work on being our own person with our own beliefs, principles, and life goals while in relationship with others. This is not the same as being a rebel, because when you think about it, a rebel spends a lot of energy thinking about and posturing themselves against the group. Instead, differentiation is about working to live out one's principles in the face of relationship pressure to conform or oppose the group, which I know maybe highlights some of the less usefulness of the group, but we'll course correct in our conversation. And then from Dr. Bowen, people with better levels of differentiation are less relationship directed and more able to follow independent life goals. They are not unaware of the relationship system, but their life courses can be determined from within themselves than from what others think. They are more clear about the differences between emotion and intellect, and they are better able to state their own convictions and beliefs calmly without attacking the beliefs of others or without having to defend their own. They are better able to accurately evaluate themselves in relation to others without the pretend posture that results in overvaluing or undervaluing themselves. And one other quote, differentiation cannot take place in a vacuum. It has to take place in relation to others around issues important to both people. And then I was also thinking about terms that are used for differentiation. So defining a self, working towards individuation, or, Jenny Brown's idea of growing yourself up. I'm not sure if there's other phrases you guys think of.
Maturity. I think people talk about maturity often, and immature, mature. I don't know if I always buy that one, but
yeah.
Mainly because I think it puts a positive or negative on it. Like you're saying one is better than the other. And I think that the more I study Bowen theory, the less I think that one way is necessarily better than the other. It's just understanding, as Bowen, the one I always like, you're dealt this set of cards. What are you going to do with it? I think that's more
right
where I land.
Yeah. I think that kind of the idea of being a self or defining a self, the differentiation, that would be a concept I hear people trying to grapple with. And it picks up what you were saying, Dixie, is that taking on the work of differentiation doesn't happen in isolation from the relationship system. It happens in the relationship system. The example I thought about is the movie Moana and the other movie Encanto. Both of those are stories of families over generations where by the time the grandchildren are walking the earth, they're inheriting certain expectations. The system is organized around certain ways that all of us exist. And this is the way we are. And in both of those movies, the grandchild is encountering a sense of, but wait a minute, I think about things a little bit differently. I see things a little bit differently. And as that shift in their ability to consider differently for self, they're faced with a tension point. Do I continue to pursue my own way of being? Do I just lose my way of being to get along with this group. In both cases, these young girls found middle ways where they pursued their own way of being, but continued to stay in relationship with the rest of the family. Those movies for me highlight, one, just how automatic it is for us to be organized by other. And that other organization really is universal to all of life. Even bacteria face this struggle. Glom on with the rest of the cells in the unit or start to be separate from and they have risk-taking behaviors where they go and try new things. What makes a bacteria colony really successful is as an individual cell does something new, it retains its learning and passes the learning back to the rest of the system. So there's an innate benefit to operating for self, but relating to other.
Mm.
I think anxiety living in the human family tells us that it has to be one or the other. It's you or it's me. And I love that Moana and Encanto hit that challenge. Both of those young women are faced with, I can't survive if I stick in this. And yet they ultimately figure out how to both be very strong, clear, wise leaders from self as they relate to other. To me, that sets up the arc of what differentiation can produce.
My movie example went exactly the opposite way, that I thought of much less G-rated, but I thought of, and I haven't watched that many seasons, but of Yellowstone, the show that they've now made multi, prequels to, about a family that is so embedded in their, this is what we do.
Yeah.
And then they start, if anyone who's watched the show, it goes off the rail. Like they get violence and there's challenge and, kind of a cost of what it takes to continue to be a part of that system that they've been set up for generation upon generation. What is the challenge to thinking as a self in that system? So I thought that was my opposite to your kind of Moana, like the side of people being able to figure out how to be a self and stay in contact. And I think, what I've watched of Yellowstone, I don't know that there are many characters that have figured out how to be separate from that family and stay in contact. There's a lot of cutoff where they aren't able to manage that.
Yeah. I think you're describing too that when a family is faced with a tremendous amount of kind of acute challenge, Yellowstone would present that way. The Moana situation, there was the acute challenge of environmental change. Mm-hmm. And Kanto is the acute challenge of aggression from an outside oppressor that impacts the family's basic functioning. But the retained fear and automatic response to that acute challenge shows up. We use the language of chronic anxiety. It tilts the automatic of the family and how it organizes its relationships to remember the past challenge, but maybe it loses some ability to notice, hey, just because our land was threatened in Yellowstone 800 years ago doesn't mean we have to act like somebody driving on our property is World War III.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't even think that was such a good example of chronic anxiety, but that really, it does. It shows how they're perceiving everything as a massive threat.
Yeah.
And circumstances would say they're doing pretty well.
But what you really lifted up, Katie, which is so powerful, is that in the perception of that massive threat, and it's a shared perception, right? They're so connected to each other. The togetherness force is so powerful that if one thinks it, everybody thinks it. And then the reaction, because of that fusion, is so intense, it's so automatic that they don't have a lot of nuance in their response. It's like, I will kill you or I will attack you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we see that. I mean, I think all of us can think about ways that shows up in our family to some degree or another, which was the part I wanted to make sure we talked about on these 2 episodes, is the variation that can exist across the spectrum of human about, how families, vary in their, their ability to manage separating these two.
Well, my example just like last episode, is Inside Out 2. And in that movie, they literally, Riley, who is now 13, is developing her sense of self. And you see it as this sort of lit up thing in her brain. And then she becomes a teenager. And I'm not going to give away all of the movie, but it gets essentially knocked off. And her sense of self is all oriented to her peer group, away from her parents and all of the how do I fit in. And I thought it just highlighted so well this this process of which, and when you think about sort of developmental stages, moving away from parents and beginning to engage in the world is necessary, useful, can be wonderful, and is complicated, right? And so I thought the movie just highlighted so well the process of how do you hold onto your own values in the midst of these other relationships.
I liked what, as Katie was talking, I was imagining what you were saying, Dixie, and thinking, and there's variation in how individuals and families are like kind of sensitive and responsive to one another. That would also translate into the degree to which you are sensitive and responsive and dependent on others in terms of peer set, employer, political movements, cultural trends.
Religion.
Yeah, religion for sure. What do you think it takes to have an ability to know and relate to the other, but not always just adopt and assume the position of the other?
I think one of the things that came to me with that question was an open system, somewhat of an open system. I mean, I have, we were talking about small towns in the midst of, in the break. And I was just thinking about that question of, I know that I've lived in another country and I have been exposed to ideas and thinking. I've traveled a little bit outside of my family system to have a little more information into my system that I begin to think through. And my family had a level of tolerance to that. So I'm going to call my mom out. She didn't have a great level of tolerance when I decided to move to another country. She was not real pleased with it at first. But I think that would be one of the things that I would think about if a system, is so closed that it doesn't allow any other information in. I would assume it would decrease the likelihood that maybe there would be something within the system. I'm challenging my own thinking there that would search that out versus another, member of the system that wouldn't. But I would think some level of openness would allow for this.
Well, and I observe in myself who are the people where I shut up and who are the people that I speak up maturely or turn into a bit of a jackass. And I've seen the process in my family of, sort of like I was a card-carrying member of the political party that my dad is a part of. And I was like going for it. And then I thought what was thinking my own thoughts, but I'm pretty sure I was just thinking the thoughts of the people I engaged with at university. And then my posture was on election day, hey, Dad, I'm going to go cancel out your vote. Ha, ha, ha. Right? As a way of, look at how different I am, Dad. And the work for me is, can I have a conversation with my dad where I put my own thoughts about this is why this political issue is meaningful to me, and how did you get to that type of, position? And that's my work.
Yeah. And I hear that, Dixie, I think that's such a cool example of like togetherness operating in a family might produce a really closed system, which is like, this is how we think. We all think this way. But it could also operate in a very reactive system, which is we're wide open to anything. And then it could have a middle mix, which is we're closed and antagonistic of each other. We pick polarizations within our family. I would imagine that togetherness force, how it organizes and relates, changes as you go down, up and down the scale of differentiation. As you have more of an intellectual system and more individuality available, the balance or the ballast that the other development can provide leaves you with an ability to be open sometimes and closed others. But the individuality force would allow for the choice to be made based on the intellectual system, not necessarily just the reaction to the other in the togetherness force.
And maybe this is the time to describe that, the scale of differentiation and what it is and why it matters.
What I like about it is it provides a way of just being able to observe. So it's just a framework that you could begin to ask questions. What's the variation in functioning around the togetherness force and the individuality force? And Bowen posits that at the zero end of the scale, most people there are so oriented to the other. They're just entirely dependent on the relationship system to say who they are and how they should behave.
Right.
And the dependency could be both in a compliance, I'm going to just do exactly what happens, or in a rebellious.
Right.
At the other side of the continuum, and again, this is hypothetical. Bowen just posits this is possible. He didn't have any evidence that it was real. At the other side, there would be as much individuality as there is togetherness. And that depending on the circumstances of the family's need to adapt to challenge and the individual's need to adapt to challenge, there would be choice. Again, if a bear comes into my office and I have lots of people with me, you don't want to have, hey, let's pause, think about this. Everybody come up with your own best thinking. Let's test out 10 strategies and then come back in, evaluate it, right? If it's a true emergency, you really want that togetherness force to take over and organize and orient to the real challenge. Most of the time, we're not living in that space. It feels like it when we're watching Instagram and we're seeing worst case scenarios and how to survive.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time, we don't need to rely on the automatic relate to other, react, and respond quickly to other. So the scale, I think, sometimes people use it as like a diagnostic or an assessment tool that then would define. I find it more as an invitation and to observe, and then a planning tool to help me imagine what would it look like if I were operating with a little tiny bit more of this or a little bit less of that.
Yeah. That was just the thing that came up to me too, is for me, the scale is interesting to observe the variability, between families, within families, just to begin to see how people show up differently and the resources that is to my system. I think that's been something I've been thinking about, is both the people who might theoretically be lower on the scale are as useful and important to the system as one who might be higher up. The A student in me always thinks you want to be better. But I think that just respecting that the scale gives me that, if I can stay neutral, it gives me that ability to see, just be interested in people.
Yeah. I think the question that always sits with me is, do I want to have a team, a soccer team, that is just filled with all goalies and they're all functioning in a certain way? Goalies are pretty like solo players. They need to know where the rest of the team is, but really their functioning is pretty independently oriented.
Mm.
But in order to play a really robust soccer game, I need to have a field that has a lot of variation in who can do what. And I want to have players that are super sensitive to each other, but also super able to think and be and do for self.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that. What would you think about if you're designing the family that's going to work the best? I mean, I think a lot of people think about that from a business standpoint too. Like if, a traditional idea of how does a team look the best? Do you have all the people who are like leaders? Do you want to get a bunch of leaders together? Do you want people who can, this is not a good example that I'm walking through.
Yeah. Let me flip what you're saying to how I heard it and what I think, which is, remember, Bowen theory is a natural systems theory that is following this idea of evolutionary theory. So the fact is the families that we are a part of and that we are witnessing and working with, they are products of a multi-generational, multi-millennia pattern of resiliency. They do not require any kind of engineering process to help construct a better family. What I think they need to do is be able to see and acknowledge and honor the strengths that live in that family, and then ask the question, how would we capitalize on the gifts and talents of this team as it has been created, finely tuned? Can we use strengths that live in us?
Thank you. That was a good helping me out there with and I was thinking when I wrote this down is really that also hits at that developmental part, that you can watch this individuality and togetherness in, a parent-child relationship, how it develops and how it might develop differently with one child versus another. We keep bringing and talking around this idea of tension or chronic anxiety, but to really learn about how your family functions, to get some facts about what went on when I was born versus my sibling was born.
Right. As you were struggling, not struggling, as you were working through your example, Katie, I was like, I'm such a bad pastor's wife, because somewhere in the Bible it talks about, somewhere in the New Testament, one body, many parts. And if the eye says to an eye, why aren't you or no, I don't see, I can't remember it, but I think it's such a useful idea that, yeah, there's differences and how do they work together. My idea for sort of the usefulness of this idea is, for me, I think about, where does my energy go and how automatically it goes to what will others think of this? And do I put as much energy into what do I think about this as what do the experts think? What do others think? How will they respond? And so that's one of the ways that I sort of frame this in my mind in sort of daily life.
Yeah, I think it's useful just if you know that there are two life forces that are kind of striving for the driver's seat. It's useful to me. And I think this is akin to what you're saying about the energy. Is this coming from within me? Is this something that I think and want and need for myself? Or is this in reaction or response to other? And we picked up on it a little bit the last conversation, but even kind of an intellectual argument, or what sometimes people talk about as an I position, to drive a little bit deeper down and ask, is this something that is coming really from me? How would I know? The piece I'd put in there is that togetherness force is also kind of living in our family and in the multi-generational family process. So it's, am I being a version of my mother? Am I being in reaction to my father in the life that I say I am choosing for myself? And just, I don't know I don't have a good formula yet about what to do with it, but what I have found is so useful is just to be able to ask that question. Because by asking the question, I'm automatically shifting it out of an emotional system process into an intellectual system process.
And can you say once more the question that you ask? Is it just about self versus relationship, or emotion, intellect?
Is it, it's just as primary as, is this a togetherness force driven thing, or is it an individuality force? And that, like, how would I know the difference? Katie and I sometimes joke, like, back and forth, you can hear, well, how would you measure that?
Yeah.
But asking yourself the question of how would you measure something changes the parts of your brain that are driving the process.
Right.
What would you notice if this was different?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking the multi-generational part is taking the question, I found it useful when people have asked me to take it up to the next generation, even people who are no longer with us, right? Like, what would your grandmother have said about that? Or, what would, your aunt have said about that? To think about just getting a little broader in learning about and knowing the system and expanding it. So that's been useful to me to think of that multi-generational, or to even actually get factual and see what they did, right? What did the family actually do when they were faced with some tension? Did people come together? I mean, I've studied enough of my family to know that there is a strong come together in crisis that has been really useful in the continuation of my line, right? That this idea that when there is a crisis, family pulls together, no questions asked, move to, compile resources has been really useful.
Yeah. I was thinking with that adaptation being embedded in all of us, right? The relationship system emerges to support life moving forward, to adapt. And I was thinking about how automatic it is for each of us that togetherness force orients us toward other. I'm unhappy, I'm upset, I need, I want, and we just look to our partners, to our kids, to our parents. And that as we grow up on that individuality force, we start to be able to ask and respond to, do I need other to meet this? Is it necessary? How could I solve it from within?
Yeah, I was going to get a little nerdy science. I put down, I think that I get interested in some of the research on loneliness and talking about how it is one of those internal systems that is saying that we need other humans to survive, but how sometimes that internal guidance system, I'll often sometimes say like it's check engine light, like a way that you can go off the rails, right? It can start not being accurate in what it's sensing. And so to think about again, back to that benefit of having both of these forces to think through.
Well, we're getting near the end of our time. So are there takeaways or resources or, a question, an idea that people can think going forward?
My takeaway was just remembering coaching little kid soccer and watching little kid soccer at 4 years old, 5 years old. All you watch is the whole group of kiddos. Yeah, literally, they just run around the field in a glump. And it's cute and it's sweet, but it's not very sophisticated. And it certainly isn't like high level, complex team functioning. And, we're getting ready to go into the Olympics, and I am so psyched to watch more high level team soccer where each player has a basic capacity, athletic prowess that is deep within self. And they know how to trust and relate to the other in service to the overall goals of winning championships. And for what it's worth, the degree to which any relationship could operate from just really solid, mature, exquisitely refined self and relate thoughtfully to other, that would just be such a more fun relationship for everybody than little kid soccer showing up in the marriage at the breakfast table 28 years into it.
And I thought about the Olympics because it's taped. I'm so excited. I love the Olympics. It's taped on my set to tape, but I was thinking when this is probably aired, it will be the time right around the US election. And even though, I can say I'm living in Canada now, people will be watching that and thinking about that and talking about that. And I just thought that would be another place to just observe yourself and an opportunity to think about how do you want to show up? Where do you get pulled in? Where do you lose your thinking? Where do you take the same position as the person you're married to or your parent. So I thought, that would be a way that my takeaway would be to just get curious about these things. How do you see it? And to attempt to not see the good and bad, but just be interested in what you do and don't do.
Mm-hmm.
That will
One
be
of
a
the
system.
One of the assignments I've found so helpful in my 3 years at Living Systems is the beliefs paper that we have to do every year. And, pick a topic. What do you believe? How much is rooted in fact? What was transmitted to you from others? Just looking at the process of how we adopt beliefs, and when you shake it all out, do you see things differently? And I think it's just so helpful in terms of knowing my own thoughts, but also seeing how they're impacted by relationships.
Yeah, maybe if we're going to post, I always say, do we post, or if we have show notes? Victoria Harrison has a really great article on the beliefs paper in the Family Systems Forum that maybe we could link to here.
Perfect.
Dixie, what you said though, really, and what Katie's saying, working on differentiation isn't grand, big, or enormous steps, but it's like baby steps, little tiny things. Like a position I took for self was I wasn't going to inside out the laundry anymore. And it was really hard not to inside out the laundry. I was worried about my family's upset that they were going to have to deal with their own genes. But it was a position I had thought through and held and took for self. And differentiation happens in baby steps, not in grand leaps.
Yeah, it's a great reminder.
It really is, because I think this is one of my little bugbears with Bowen is, man, this is a tough term, right? Differentiation of self. If there, I know he worked really hard and was thoughtful, but to just think about it as those little steps, it's more approachable.
Yeah. And it's a lifetime. It's not something you do and then it's done. It is actually an everyday kind of effort to think and be for self while relating to others.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Amie.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everyone who's tuned in for this episode and our first season of Elevator Systems. I hope the podcast has been a useful introduction to Bowen family systems theory and some of the resources available on it. But even more so, I hope it has stirred people's own questions and thinking that you can be just a bit more curious as you go out into your relationships. And we'll see you next season, hopefully. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.